9:30 on my computer as Sue Ann is starting to record. Thank you, Sue Ann. Let me acknowledge that. So once again, to those of you watching us on Zoom, I don't have the sound on, but I do have the chat open. So if you have questions, comments, if you throw it in the chat, eventually I'll realize there's something there and pay attention to it. I might be a little slow on that. All right, well, welcome everybody. I want to start with just a general question. Do you think that people are essentially good or essentially bad or somewhere in between? And if you say in between, you got to be a little more specific than just, somewhere in between. Are we essentially good, bad?
Yes. Essentially good. That's what essentially good.
That doesn't mean all good. Essentially good doesn't mean all good.
Some essential.
Okay, so tease apart the difference there between essential good but not all good.
Well, I think the real test for me is I love all you people. I want to be good with all you people. I try to do it. But if there's one donut hole left on the tray, I'll get there and grab it before you can.
All right, so Jerry is essentially good, except when it comes to the last donut hole. Yeah, okay, so yeah, there are general dispositions that we have, but there are moments when we feel that that's contested a little bit, or we feel.
Can I add one little thing to that?
Please. Yeah.
And that is, okay, it's sort of chuckled the donut hole. But what if you're really, really hungry,
Right,
and you have no food, and that donut hole means something to you different than for us, just another donut hole?
Right.
That creates the human condition.
Right.
That I haven't become worse, you haven't become worse, but all at once now we have something that could fire up.
right. So I'm hoping you guys on the Zoom can hear that. That's great. So generally, I'd be willing to let you have the last donut hole. Knowing this congregation, we would out nice each other, right? Oh no, you have. Oh no, you have. Oh no, I've had. But if somebody's really hungry, and this is really sustenance, maybe something a little more sustaining than donut holes, then it becomes. This is the source of battles. This is where our worst tendencies kind of kick in. And so the question is whether those worst tendencies are also a part of who we are essentially or not. Yes, sir.
It was the case of racing Jerry for the donut hole. I go, who's going to be running awfully fast?
Yeah. So for every example, you can start coming up with what ifs, right? What if this, what if that? And so you have ancillary stuff. That's why I'm using the word essential. At the heart of your being, at the heart of human being, are we essentially good, or are we essentially not good, or something other? And I'm just using the words good and not good in general terms, kind to neighbors, not overwhelmingly boisterous, things like that. This is a real question. It's a real question. And of course, you can pose it in a number of ways. Like, is bad behavior, is that inborn or is it inbred, right? Is it part of who we are essentially, or is it part of who we become by virtue of growing up in community? Now, most of us tended toward we're essentially good. And that's because you're in a room full of people who are just wonderful folk. And you don't look at them and think, oh, right? But what if you grew up a slave? What if you grew up in a severely oppressive context? What if your parents died in the Shoah, the Holocaust? What if your country has been systemically deprived by Christian European country. You know, what if your contexts were very, very different? What if you grew up in a crack house and have never known life really outside of that? I mean, would you so automatically say we're essentially good? Or would you just say, you know, life's a war and you just have to survive? Good is beside the point. That too is a different set of questions. I mean, we're all relatively privileged in the best sense of the term, that we're surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses. This is good. This is a blessing. Not everybody has that. And so so the question, the whole point of view from which you address the question, are we good, evil? Where does evil come from? Yada yada. A lot of how you see it depends on where you stand and where you've been situated in life. That's one reason why biblical commentators kind of pay attention to try to go behind the text and figure out when it was written and what was going on with the communities that wrote these texts and so forth. And it's one reason why sometimes when we read biblical text, we read into it almost as much as we read in it, if you know what I mean. So for example, there's nothing in Genesis chapter 3 that says this serpent is the devil, right? Nothing equates this serpent with Satan. I think the first time that was done in literature actually might have been in the Quran. I'm not entirely sure. It's certainly not in Genesis. So, but I grew up hearing that. I mean, I just grew up knowing this was the devil in the form of a snake. And assuming then, when I went back and read the story, when it said serpent, oh, there's the devil. But nothing in the story says that. I grew up assuming that this is the reason why we're all so bad. In Adam's fall, we sinned all. That was a sinned all. That was a phrase from a Puritan workbook that children were given in the Northeast colonies toward the beginning of town life in the United States. It reflected the words from the Westminster Catechism about this story and why we're fallen. I grew up hearing that this is the story of the fall. That phrase is nowhere in here. So there's just a lot about this chapter that we have heard and heard and heard, and presumptions now that have been ground into us that we bring to the story.
We've
And-
crusted it.
I'm sorry?
We've crusted it. Crusted.
Accrusted it. Yeah, and the reason I want to ask you about human nature is because this might be one account in the scriptures of where evil comes from. I'm not entirely sure, but it's an inescapable question. It was a question for the biblical writers. It's a question for us. So as we read this story, it's not inordinate that we ask, where does evil come from? Even if the story itself doesn't exactly talk about the origin of evil. Does that make sense? These are questions that we always carry with us. So let's do our best to see what's in the text, and let's do our best to see what's in our minds as we read the text, and maybe keep those a little separate, but honor both. Honor both. It is not wrong to ask the question of the origin of evil. It may just be wrong to expect that Genesis chapter 3 answers it. or answered it fully. Okay, does that make sense? I'm just trying to get us started on a naive reading of this text in some ways, but just kind of, as much as we can, wipe the slate clean and just say, what is this thing? Okay, so let's look at the story for a minute. We got the serpent. It's a talking animal. And nobody telling the story or in the story seemed the least bit compelled to explain what's up with that. You have a talking animal. Only one other talking animal that I know of in the Bible, and that's Balaam's donkey, right? Who by the power of God is able to speak to this prophet and show him that he's being a false prophet. So talking animals, that doesn't happen every day. I'm sure we've all tried with puppies and so forth as we've grown up. And yet the story takes that very casually. If you hear a story, any other story outside of the Bible about a talking animal, do you believe that story literally? No way, right? You immediately dismiss it. You might believe it meaningfully as a moral tale, but you're not reading it as a literal story. Many people will read this and say, well, it was just a talking animal because that's what the Bible says. And it really challenges us from the beginning, and perhaps was the storyteller's way of saying, look, don't take this literally. You know, animals don't talk. But if I'm telling you a story and I use talking animal, I don't have to tell you, hey, don't take this literally, right? You're going to assume that. And I shape that by giving you a talking animal. We've got a talking serpent and apparently a walking serpent who only laterly is going to be consigned to slithering on the ground. It's not identified as Satan. It is identified only as the most crafty of all the animals. So anything you want to say about the serpent, anything you want to ask, how does this talking serpent shape your way of reading the story? Do you associate the talking serpent with the devil, Satan, or what have you?
Well, this is all fantasy. This
Okay.
is fantasy.
So what do you mean by fantasy, though? What do you mean by fantasy?
This is a fairy tale. There's no reality in terms of, there was no Adam and Eve, there was no Garden of Eden, there was no serpent. We know enough about the way life was created today to know that this is a nice story, but it has nothing to do with proto-humans coming out of Africa, moving whatever, and the like. So my question is, and my difficulty in the last couple of days in reading about this is I'd really like to read 5 or 10 other creation stories from other peoples. This is a Hebrew creation story. What do we need from it? What are 5 other creation stories? What is that creating? Because no one knows what creation was and when the first human that we would call human was. So what are we needing from this? And in it, one of the most interesting things, sin and good and evil and all that's there. But one of the real shocks when you get to it is man became before woman. God pulls the what out to create the woman. Almost certainly in life, the egg came before the sperm. I mean, whether you call man or woman, male, female, or whatever, in whatever the world.
Right.
So why did that creep into here?
Yeah.
Is it that we need, as men who wrote the story and want to be in control, need to justify that we're the top dog? I mean,
Yeah.
that's just an odd thing to have come out of
Right,
this
so
story. So,
let me ask you one question real quickly, and then we'll go ahead and pivot over to what's up with the man coming first. You're saying it's a fairy tale because we know science and we know evolution and so forth. Do you think the writer thought it was a fairy tale? Or do you think they believed this is really?
I gotta believe they're creating one night. It's sort of like laying under the stars and looking at the stars and creating a story. And I think that's how this was created, as a story that satisfied some need. So
Okay,
That's
so
a
it answers
satisfying
some
need.
questions, but not necessarily like, I'm not saying this really happened once upon a time.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. Just want to be clear about that, because I think sometimes when we talk about the scriptures as being not literally true or mythical or fairy tale, some people imagine that the writers didn't know that. You know, they talk about how the biblical world thought there was a three-storied universe with the underground and then the place where life plays out, and then the heavens above the cloud. But, you know, even if that was kind of the general framework, biblical people didn't look up on a cloudless day and say, oh, look, there's no more heaven, right? I mean, they weren't that literal. and I think sometimes we underserve. They've got their own kind of wisdom, and they're showing that. One of which might be this. Yes, Adam comes first. Adam is the human made out of dust and breathing the breath of God. Adam comes from the Adamah. So if you want to know what the egg is in this story, it's the ground. The egg, the ground is there first. It's there at the beginning of the story. And then it becomes fertile. And out of the ground, God the potter, which is probably women's work, makes the human. The verb for make is a very active thing. Maybe formed would be a better, you know, it's almost like God as an artisan in some ways. Later in the story, when God makes them garments out of animal skins, it's the common word for make. But this one's formed, right? So God molds the Adam out of the Adamah. The Adamah would be the egg. The Adam would be the one that comes out of that. And then later, God takes the Adam and forms the woman out of its side. And in that respect, they become male and female, and the female emerging from the male. So that your question comes at that point in the story, I think. It would seem that this story has been written by a bunch of men. Fairly common of the biblical story. And while the word helper is probably better companion, and while it does not signify subservience, this is the woman's call, is to help the man as the man helps God in tilling the garden. So you kind of have to read that how you will. I don't know if it's a sideways advance or if there's a hierarchy being posed here or not. But that's what we get with these old texts, right? There's just an enormous amount of truth and power in them, but they reflect the perspectives of the communities that wrote them. They just do. And the biblical communities that gave us the Bible knew that. They know the story in Genesis chapter 1 isn't the same as the story in Genesis chapter 2. They didn't say, well, one of these is wrong, and cut it out and say, well, let's just go with this. They gave it to us, almost as if to say, look, here are ways of looking at creation. Don't take either of them literally. Don't choose one over the other. These are ways of looking at creation, and they both say wonderful things, insightful things, wisdom here. But but not necessarily scientific or liberal things, right? And they reflect different communities who see the world different. Okay, let me walk out. We start with a serpent, a talking, walking serpent. To me, I'm just going to say, to me, that's the storyteller's way of saying, here's a thing that never really happened, but it's absolutely true. That's how I like to start stories. This didn't really happen, but boy, is it true. Walking, talking serpent. And then we have the fruit. Okay, let's see a show of hands. How many of you grew up assuming this is an apple? Right? You know, that's because we took apples to school in our lunch bags, right? Nothing says apple, right?
What kind?
I'm sorry.
What kind?
Yeah, they were very kind. Nothing about this says apple, right? It's a fruit. But we're sold that it's an apple.
In all those pictures,
I know all the pictures.
Yeah.
Look, I had a Sunday school teacher once. I remember this because, you know, she was the older sister of one of my best friends at church. So of course I had a crush on her. And she was our teacher, and she had these little learning aids, and one with a picture of Eve, you know, who happened to be standing behind a bush that came all the way up to here. And she was reaching up for an apple. And the teacher was, this is Eve. Isn't she beautiful? And I thought, what? Even as a kid, I was like, what? Not Eve. I mean, yeah, whoever's in that picture is beautiful, but that's somebody's drawing. But that's what we've done with Eve, right? and the fruit and the well, we made it a nice big juicy red delicious, which was what was in that picture. You've got Eve. What does she do in this story? First of all, it seems that throughout this conversation, or at least when she decided to eat the fruit, Adam is with her. Adam is with her. Okay, let's pay special attention to that. Look at verse 6. So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate. She also gave some to her husband, who was with her, and he ate. It's often overlooked, that phrase, who was with her.
So why didn't he warn her?
Well, one would imagine that he's going along with it.
I'm just saying.
Yeah. I mean, that's a great question. And it's a speculative question. We don't know. But it's a good question to pose to people who want to put all of this on Eve.
Yeah.
Women, you know, they did this, right? Because he's standing right there. I keep trying to say that in my video, and anytime I talk, he's standing right there. And he does not protest, nor does he resist. He they're together. Eve corrects the serpent. So Adam has communicated to Eve what God said about the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. She looks and sees that the tree is beautiful, good, delightful to the eyes. That's a phrase that we saw in the second chapter, described in the whole Garden of Eden, right? Trees that were delightful to the eye. Beauty matters. And so it's beautiful, attractive, and somehow she could look at the tree and see that it was desired to make one wise. The storytellers don't tell us how she figured that out, right? I've not ever looked at a plant or a tree and seen that quality within it. So you have to go with it, just like you have to go with a talking serpent. It has been suggested to her that this tree will make her wise, and she looks and she sees it that way. It may well be the power of suggestion. That the ancient communities were quite aware that as soon as somebody tells you, oh, whenever Mark wears his blue suit, it's because he's not real sure about his sermon. And from that day on, every time I'm wearing a blue suit, you're like listening for me stumbling for words and watching me think. And so I just made that up, by the way, but I do have a blue suit. But you see how planting something in somebody's head? Does anyone know who came up with this delightful phrase that I want to attribute correctly? That to prepare for war is to be predisposed to war. Anybody know who wrote that? I thought I'd find Clausewitz, but I don't think it is. All right, to prepare for war, what does that mean? It means that if you are going to go to all the trouble to even to defend yourself, someone has instilled in you a notion of an enemy and a fear of that enemy and a reckoning that that enemy is about to strike. So now you prepare yourself for war, which means now you are predisposed to war. The slightest provocation. Perhaps even you would cross the line and say, sometimes you have to do a preeminent strike to prevent them from striking us. You see how the power of suggestion works there? In some respects, we see that happening in this story, at least it's being suggested that once she's told the tree will make them wise, she looks and goes, oh, you know what, that tree does look like it will make us wise. So she looks, she sees its beauty, she desires its wisdom, she takes the fruit, she eats the fruit, she shares the fruit. That's Eve. What else do we need to say about her in this story? Oh, she's going to blame the snake, the serpent, later. Okay, let's look at Adam in this story. Adam's relatively passive. She gives him the fruit, he takes it and eats it, and then he blames her. Right?
Playing the role of victim.
Oh, that's what blaming is all about, right? Passing the buck.
Seems like our household. I sit and eat and say, Bobby, that wasn't as good as last week. Go on, I mean, you know, that's.
Have you ever literally said that and actually eaten again? Yeah, imagine.
Yeah, he doesn't get fat after that.
Yeah, I would say that's a good way to be on your own, buddy. Yeah, you know, I mean, passing the buck, blaming is what we do. Yes, ma'am.
He also blames God for giving him.
That's
the
right.
woman.
That's right. There's blame A and B, right? The woman whom you gave me, right? That's not an insignificant, right? And also not untrue. The woman might have said, the serpent that you created and gave the uncanny ability to talk. It deceived me and made more crafty than all the other animals, right? She'd be better off talking to a cow or something. The serpent doesn't get to speak back. Okay. The other thing that's interesting here, though, is how God is depicted in this story. This is not the way God looks in Genesis chapter 1, right? Where God speaks and things happen. This God walks. This God doesn't know certain things. This God makes things out of dirt, wet clay. This God is a seamstress. This God asks questions. And this God says, oh no, they've now eaten of the top tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which means the serpent was not wrong. Now, if they eat from the tree of life, that will be a disaster. They will become, as this God says, like us. Now suddenly we got that plural language, and I'm not real sure, but we're going to see that language again. we're not going to study it. You'll see it again if you read Genesis chapter 11, when the people build the Tower of Babel. And God says, if we let them do this, there won't be anything they can't do. So God scatters their language and sends them out along the earth. So again, God using we language, that's the curious thing for us, isn't it? Because we're so grounded in monotheism. And of course, some people will excuse that and say this is the triune God talking amongst himself, themselves. I mentioned in my presentation, I think it's correct, the 82nd Psalm, where God is addressing the divine council. I don't think it's unusual for Old Testament folk to figure that God is not alone in heaven, but that there is kind of a pantheon of sorts. And later it will sort out to be, archangels and angels and all of that. But it was just commonly thought in that time that that God is plurality, the Elohim. That very common word for God is a plural word. But the insistence that God is one means that you don't have the gods fighting amongst themselves like you do in Norse theology or Roman or Greek mythology. Yeah, yes, sir.
What is the date of authorship of this?
Yeah.
And what is the context in which this arises?
Yeah, so, I don't know. I'll tell you what I've heard and read is some people think perhaps it was written during the time of Solomon or shortly thereafter when people remembered the time of Solomon well. Why? Because as I mentioned in the video, it's during a time of relative peace and prosperity that kingly folk install gardens. And it's not just the king, but all the elite folk. You have the leisure to build these beautiful gardens and cultivate them and till them. And that continues through many, many years to be a sign of peace and prosperity. That you can have a garden. And this is the garden you enjoy, just like God comes down and walks in the evening for the cool of the garden. That they have that wonderful purpose, and they're sustaining gardens, you can eat and so forth. So some people would imagine that if it's not written during the Solomonic period, during David's reign, they were constantly at war, more or less, until the very end. But during Solomon's reign, there's really not much talk about war. And that seems to be kind of the time of perpetual peace. After Solomon died, then his son became a spoiled brat, and the kingdom broke into northern and southern Israel and Judah. But during the Solomonic time, that seemed to be kind of great. On the other hand, the threat to Israel and Judah, which turned out to be a reality later, was, of course, Babylon and Assyria. And notice how these 4 rivers that come out of Eden, they go around Mesopotamia, they kind of, they're the source of life even for these folks. And so that's, there are some scholars that feel like maybe it was on the verge of, or maybe during the initial stages of the exile, that this might have been written as a way of assuring those who have been taken into exile that they too are part of, the expansive rivers of Eden, the ground, the fertile ground, and so forth. So when it comes to dating when a text is written, you just have to look for clues like that to where you're assuming this is what the life of the writers is about. the other hard thing to figure out there is that if these stories were told orally for a lot of years, could have been that the story orally was started during the reign of Solomon, but it wasn't actually written till sometime after that. If that make, I'm just telling you how it is that biblical scholars try to follow these trails and say that. But I do think most biblical scholars are starting to be a lot more reserved and humble when they try to pick dates. Back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, they would say, oh, this was written here. You can tell because of this, you know, and there'd be periods after all those statements. Now they're commas saying this is possible. Anyway, let's push forward a little bit. I mentioned to you the 5 things that Walter Brueggemann warns us about in this text. I hope you had a chance to see the video. Did you have any questions about that? Not central to the following text, it's marginal. It's not best described as the fall. If you read the texts that follow, it's not the origin of evil. It's not the origin of death. And it's not about sex or sexual sin. Anybody want to argue with Walter Brueggemann about this?
Well, you go online and look for commentary on Genesis 3. It's all about this.
Yeah, that starts early on.
And it's hard to find anything that deviates from this pattern. So,
Right. Yeah. So that's Google's fault. That's the fault of our search engine because they're not programmed to take us to the better source. Okay. And there are better sources. But they're kind of hard to get to. Like I can get to them because I'm an alum of a seminary and I have access to a database that has more scholarly articles. You need scholarly articles. A lot of the popular stuff is just going with the flow. But let's inquire of how that happened. So I want to be real clear what Brueggemann's saying. So for example, if you look on your sheet at number 3, let's just go with B. Genesis 3 is not best described as the fall. Okay. In terms of the whole Bible, it might be described as the fall. When you look at how Paul interpreted it, or how others might mention it. What Brueggemann is saying is that in the text that follows, let's say throughout the first 5, 6 books of the Old Testament, none of this is true. In the texts that were obviously, or that seem to have been written by the same people who wrote this story, this is not how they're shaping those texts. They don't reach back to Eden all the time and say, see, this is how humans are. See, the woman did this. They don't say that. Later writers say that. So this is Brueggemann's point is these writers, that's not how they interpret themselves. It's how later people interpret. Okay. You can make a biblical point that in Adam's fall, we sinned all, but you don't make it from these writers. You would go to Paul and maybe Paul. You can't make the biblical point that Eve blew it and she's the cause of the problem. But you can go to 1 Timothy and make the case. Okay, so understand what Brueggemann's saying is from these writers, this is not how they're telling this story. How others see it later is how others see it later. So what are we saying about the Bible? I'm saying that the Bible is just filled with a conversation about the nature of good and evil and God and brokenness and all of those things. And it's a conversation where different voices are heard. And I'm convinced that they were all inspired. That is to say that God's Spirit lived among them. They were an inspired people, but they're telling you how they see things. This is the religious perspective of inspired people, and not the inspired writing of religious people. That's the distinction I'm gonna offer. Okay, so let's see how it works. Let's see how it works. I want you to look at number 4. This is what I was not able to cover in the video because I'm striving mightily to keep them to 30 minutes.
Do I know what an etiological insertion is?
I'm getting ready to say it. Yeah. Etiology is a study of origin. The study of origin. Okay, so for example, look at at chapter 2, verse 24. Therefore, a man leaves his father and mother and clings to his wife, and they become one flesh. That's obviously an insertion, because what in the story you got Adam and Eve, and they don't have a mom and dad, right? He didn't leave his family, right? So you just had a story, and someone says, this is why you leave your parents and mate yourself and you become one flesh. And by becoming one flesh doesn't mean you're buddies for life. It means you're going to have kids, right? Read the economics here. We're talking about why it is not everybody, not 5 generations are living under the same roof, right? This is how expansion of families and tribes and stuff happen. This is important stuff. But obviously has nothing to do with the creation story. It's a commentary on the creation story. Neither of them left their mom or their dad, right? So now you have, whether it's the original writers or someone later, I don't know. I don't think it's the original writers, because just doesn't seem to be where their minds are right now. But somebody think, oh, and this is why we have marriage. And this is why, kids, you have to leave the house and go find yourself a spouse. You know, it could be some angry dad who's sick of sharing the table with 12 other kids or something. But this is obviously a break from the story, right? There's no mom and dad in the story. The break from the story, and it's an explanation of why it is we do things this way. There are lots of those in the scripture. There are lots of those in the scripture. Okay. So right here already in the 2nd chapter, what we're seeing is that you got 2 things that work here. You got the story, and you've got someone helping us understand what the story is about. That's what I want you to see. It's never just one or the other. The story and someone trying to help us understand what the story is about. Does that make sense? And there it is already in the 2nd chapter. So etiological insertion, I want you to take both of those seriously. It's inserted because the story works real well without it. In fact, it seems to kind of interrupt things. And it's inserted in order to explain the origin of something. You'll see a lot of those now that you're aware of it, because I too have the power of suggestion. And you know, that happens in scripture. That's how tradition happens too. Okay, so stories are meant to be repeated, and the repetition of a story brings more people into the fold, whether it's your children or your grandchildren that you're telling this story to as a way of shaping their way of looking at the world, or whether it's guests among you for whom you share this story, where you're bringing them in. And stories are meant to be repeated, and as such, they're tradition. And that I just wanted you to see early on here, you've got a really interesting moment where the storytellers know people are reading, and they're breaking from the story to explain something else. That's happening. That's part of tradition. The second thing is I want you to look at Ezekiel chapter 28. Ezekiel is one of those prophets that we rarely read, so it takes us a long time to find. Okay, so in this chapter, Ezekiel is doing two things. First, he's standing up and speaking truth to power against the king of Tyre or Tyre, however you want to pronounce that. Okay, that's the first thing he does, and that's verses 1 through 10. And then he's issuing a lamentation over the king of Tyre. And so this is not just, hey, you're a foreign king, you're wrong, God hates you. So there, it's more like you're doing something wrong, and that is regrettable. There's a lament attached to that. But the language here, I'm just going to read a portion of it, and I want you to think about what you've heard in Genesis chapter 2 and 3, and see if you're hearing any echoes. What echoes of that story you're hearing? The word of the Lord came to me, mortal, say to the prince of Tyre, thus says the Lord God, because your heart is proud, and you have said, I am a God. I sit in the seat of the God, in the heart of the sea. Yet you are but a mortal and no God, though you compare your mind to the mind of a God. You are indeed wiser than Daniel. No secret is hidden from you. By your wisdom and your understanding, you have amassed wealth for yourself. You had gathered gold and silver in your treasury. Let me just skip down to verse 6. Therefore, thus says the Lord God, because you compare your mind with the mind of a God, therefore I will bring strangers against you. This is the condemnation, right? Okay, from that little bit that I read, verses 1 through 3, 4, and then a little bit of verse 6. Are you hearing any echoes from the creation story in Genesis 2 and the story in Genesis 3? If so, what are you hearing? Okay, you're hearing punishment. Why did Eve take the fruit? 2 reasons. What was it?
She desired it.
I'm sorry?
She desired it.
Okay. She saw that it was beautiful and she desired it, but for a specific reason.
Wisdom, right? Wisdom.
Can make one wise. Remember? The serpent says, you will not die. God doesn't want you to eat that tree because you will be wise and you will become
Like God.
like God. Wisdom, knowledge, becoming like God. That seems to be the temptation, as it were, with this tree. There are lots of trees there, and they all had good food. They could have eaten fruit anywhere, right? But this gave wisdom to be like God. That's what the serpent, crafty serpent, says about this tree. Mortal, say to the prince, mortal. The word mortal is human. It kind of taking someone out of their individuality and putting them basically into humanity. Because your heart is proud, and you said, I am a God, I sit in the seat of the gods in the heart of the sea, but you are mortal. There's a difference between mortals and God. Mortals are mortals, gods are God, and the mortal wanting to be God with knowledge and wisdom, that's a problem. And that's the problem for the king of Tyre. And that's the problem in Genesis chapter 3. You see what I mean? It's not just the acquisition of knowledge. That's happening already Humans are naming animals. They're doing science. They're doing knowledge. But to be like God, that's the temptation. If that's the right word to use. Look at the lamentation. That starts in verse 11. Moreover, the word of the Lord came to me, mortal, raise a lamentation over the king of Tyre, and say to him, thus says the Lord your God, you were the signet of perfection, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. You were in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone was your covering, carnelian, chrysolite, and moonstone, beryl, onyx, jasper, sapphire, yada, 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 yada. On the day you were created, they were prepared. With an anointed cherub as guardian, I placed you. You were on the mountain, the holy mountain of God. You walked among the stones of fire. You were blameless in your ways from the day that you were created until iniquity was found in you. So, again, this is echoing the language of Eden, right? You had it all. You had it all. There was nothing you wanted. You didn't need anything. Everything was at your disposal. There it was. And you were perfect. I mean, really, perfection, meaning completion, full, lacking nothing. That was you. And yes, you desired to be like God.
What's
And
instructive?
you're immortal.
What's instructive? Because I would posit that if we want to bring it to today, AI is the tree of knowledge.
Ah,
And
Yeah.
we're wanting to desire that knowledge. Is this instructive to us on how we should deal with today? Because there is that fruit there.
it might be, but we have to honor it first. And you're jumping ahead.
Okay,
Okay. All right. He's jumping ahead because that's what we do. It's okay. But I want to be a little tyrannical here and just kind of
Okay.
stay with the program for a second. What we're seeing is the development of tradition, right? You saw in the second chapter already, somebody's commentating on the story and doing that, taking the story and applying it to what we're facing. Why would they go to, for this reason, a man and woman will leave the house and clean? There's a question as to why we're doing it. Maybe they're in Babylon, and in Babylon, you got 12 wives. Nobody cares. Or in Babylon, you don't do that. You produce children, but you don't cleave to somebody. You don't cling to them. You just produce children, you walk away, and they're on their own. So already, the reason I want you to see tradition is that the very question you're asking are the very kinds of questions people are asking. Why is it that we have family structure the way we do? Somebody is saying, well, look at this story. What is the problem with the king of Tyre? He's got so much going on, but where is he overreaching? Where does leadership become arrogance? Where does prosperity become opulent? Well, according to Ezekiel, it's when you forget that you're mortal and you take all of these great things that God has given you, and instead of appreciating that, you want to become like God. And Ezekiel sees that in the story. If you go to Esdras, second Esdras, chapter 3, this is the first time that I know of that that the punishment to Adam is reckoned as a punishment to everybody. So remember that phrase, in Adam's fall, we sinned all. This is like a prayer, and it's going through the history of the Bible. It says, "O sovereign Lord, did you not speak at the beginning when you did form the earth, and that without help, and did command the dust, and gave you Adam a lifeless body, Yet he was the workmanship of your hand. And you did breathe into him the breath of life, and he was made alive in your presence. And you did lead him to the garden, which your right hand had planted before the earth appeared. And you did lay upon him one commandment of yours, but he transgressed it, and immediately you did appoint death for him and all of his descendants. So now somebody's asking another question. Why do we die? Why do we die? Why are we corruptible? What's happened? And this person, whoever wrote this, is taking it back to that story and said, now we die. Before that, maybe we didn't die. That's a commentary. It doesn't come from the story. The story itself, God does say, the moment you eat from this tree, you will surely die. That's in the 2nd chapter. But now you're seeing that as an inherited quality of human frailty. Okay. Again, it's tradition being built on the story. You can look at the New Testament. In Romans 5, Paul says, Adam sinned, Adam sinned, Adam sinned. And in 1 Timothy, which was not written by Paul, please say that out loud in front of anybody the time you hear them reading from Timothy. This was not written by Paul, much later letter. Timothy takes a different view and says, well, actually it was Eve. She did it. She ate first, and that's why women are subservient to men. That is the source of many, many, many sins in the church. And it's not Paul's writing, because it disagrees with Paul. In Romans 5, Paul says it's Adam. That's the problem here, not Eve. 1 Timothy, facing a different context, much more conservative outlook on the world, and blames Eve. This is tradition happening. Everybody reading the story and drawing different conclusions from it. The same thing happened in the Westminster Shorter Catechism. I see you brought that with you today. And we'll look at that, maybe just the two of us in a minute, because I've got to finish up here. Milton's Paradise Lost. I don't have time to do it, but I'd love to. Remember my Sunday school teacher who told us how beautiful Eve was? Milton started that. Yeah, Milton just fleshes out Eve like you wouldn't believe. She's adorable. She had ringlets that the gods love, just beautiful. And she blew it. And she blew it too. But she was beautiful. And that's why you women have to go through pain and childbirth. Right? So what do you have? You have a story. You have a story about humans as both earthy and divine qualities. So there's a little bit of both, and you get to write your own commentaries on to what degree you're divine and what degree you're earthy. Humans that are differentiated by gender, humans who have all they need and live an idyllic life in paradise, humans who have one command, humans who are either deceived, which is how Irenaeus says that they were like children in the garden and they were beguiled by this crafty serpent, or they showed you their true colors, which is how Augustine talks about the human as being corrupted from the very beginning. So we're getting back to that question of, are we born good or are we born corrupt? What about the work of our hands? What about the things we create? What about the artifices that we are enabled to make? What about AI? Is this, what does that say about the human condition? Are we going from the Anthropocene era, where humans have been kind of the center of it all, to a different era? If you had a computer chip implanted in your mind that enabled you to do certain things that you can't do right now, are you still human? If you're missing a leg, are you still human? We all say, of course. If you're missing both legs, of course. Both legs, 2 arms, of course. If you have nothing from here down, which one Old Testament professor I know, that's kind of his life. Are you still human? Of course. What if you had all of that, but you didn't have your brain? You had a computerized brain. Are you still human? What if you had a pig's heart? Are you still human? Be careful. Hey, there are generations past that would say, no, the heart is what makes you human. I think we've relocated that to the mind, right?
We've sent them to Congress.
That's awful. Okay, so I'm saying that you can't necessarily answer that question based on Genesis 2 and 3, but you can ask that question based on Genesis 2 and 3. And this story in Genesis 2 and 3 gives us some inspired wisdom on how to think about that question. And one of the clear warnings that Ezekiel heard from it, which I tend to agree with Ezekiel, is that being human is one thing, the aspiration to be God is another. And is that what AI is about? Is that what power is about? It didn't start with AI. It started, King of Tyre was guilty of it, right? Is that what is that what domesticating a garden is about, rather than living, in the world as God made it? Humans have been domesticating animals and crops for many, many years. What are we doing to creation? Are we being God? Aren't we supposed to? God tilled the ground and made the human to be the tiller too. Aren't we supposed to be co-creators with God? If we are, why not AI? If you can domesticate a garden, why can't we domesticate the production of intelligence? Or is that what reaching for being God is like? This story will not answer those questions definitively, but it will help us ask those questions. And maybe ask those questions in a wiser way than we might otherwise. Okay, there's just so much here, and I have to honor that it's a little past 10:30, and I have to scoot up to Orange for an 11 o'clock tour. So thank you all for being here. We'll sit on this one more time, and that's this weekend when I try to preach on it. But as you can imagine, my mind is just like a complex library right now. And out of that, we have to come up with a single sermon. Well, good luck for that. But